The afternoon of November 14th, 1954, was mild for mid-November in Harlem, with temperatures in the low 50s and occasional breaks in the cloud cover that allowed pale sunlight to reach the sidewalks of Lenox Avenue. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the street was busy with people finishing work shifts, children walking home from school, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, and the regular flow of pedestrian and vehicle traffic that characterized Harlem's main commercial corridors during the 1950s. The air carried the mixed smells of exhaust from buses and cars, cooking food from restaurants and apartments, and the distinctive scent of autumn leaves that had fallen from the few trees that lined some of Harlem's side streets. Grace Williams was 9 years old in November 1954 and had been living at Harlem Mission Home for Children for approximately 7 months. The Mission, located in a converted 4-story brownstone on West 133rd Street, housed 23 children ranging in age from 4 to 16. The facility was operated by Harlem Community Mission, a small charitable organization that had been providing services in the neighborhood since 1937. The mission received minimal funding from the city and relied primarily on private donations and volunteer labor to maintain operations. The building was chronically overcrowded, with children sleeping in rooms that housed 4 to 6 beds each. The kitchen was small and poorly equipped. The single bathroom on each floor was shared by multiple children, and the staff consisted of 3 full-time workers and several part-time volunteers who did their best with extremely limited resources. Grace had been placed at Harlem Mission Home in April 1954 after her mother died from tuberculosis, and no relatives could be located who were willing or able to take custody of her. Grace's father had left the family when Grace was 3 years old, and Grace's mother had raised her alone while working as a domestic servant in Manhattan homes. After her mother's death, Grace had spent 2 weeks in temporary foster care before being transferred to the mission when no long-term foster placement could be arranged. Grace was quiet, obedient, and performed well in school despite the difficult circumstances of her life. Grace helped with chores at the mission, looked after younger children, and caused no disciplinary problems. On the afternoon of November 14th, Grace had been sent by mission staff to deliver a message to Reverend Samuel Thompson at Mount Olive Baptist Church, located on Lenox Avenue between 132nd and 133rd Streets. The errand was simple. Grace was to inform Reverend Thompson that the mission director needed to reschedule a meeting that had been planned for the following week. Grace completed the errand successfully, speaking briefly with Reverend Thompson, who thanked her and asked her to convey his regards to the mission staff. Grace left Mount Olive Baptist Church at approximately 3:15 and began walking back to the mission. However, Grace had not eaten since breakfast that morning, which had consisted of a small portion of oatmeal and a piece of bread. The mission provided meals for its residents, but the meals were small and of poor nutritional quality due to the organization's limited budget. Grace was hungry. Grace had no money. Grace understood that she was expected to return directly to the mission, but hunger overrode her usual obedience to rules. Grace walked along Lenox Avenue, looking at the businesses and restaurants, trying to determine whether she might be able to obtain some food. Grace saw several restaurants, but understood that entering and asking for food without money would likely result in being refused or scolded. Grace saw a produce market, but knew that taking food without paying would be stealing, Something her mother had taught her was wrong. Grace continued walking, growing increasingly hungry and increasingly uncertain about what to do. At approximately 3:30, Grace reached the corner of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, where she noticed a well-dressed man standing outside a barber shop. The man was Bumpy Johnson, who was 48 years old in November 1954 and was one of the most powerful and recognized figures in Harlem. Johnson was wearing a dark wool overcoat, a gray suit underneath, a white shirt with a silk tie, and polished black leather shoes. Johnson was speaking with Marcus Reynolds, who operated the barber shop, and with whom Johnson maintained a long-standing business and personal relationship. Grace recognized Johnson because she had seen him on the streets of Harlem on previous occasions, and because children at the mission talked about him. Grace knew that Johnson was someone important in the neighborhood, and that he sometimes helped people who needed assistance. Grace also knew that approaching strangers was something her mother had warned against, but Grace was hungry enough that she decided to take the risk. Grace approached Johnson slowly, stopping a few feet away. Grace waited for Johnson to finish his conversation with Reynolds. When Johnson noticed Grace standing nearby, he turned toward her and asked whether she needed something. Grace stated that she was hungry and asked whether Johnson might give her money to buy food. Grace's voice was quiet, and her manner was polite. Grace did not beg or act desperate. Grace simply made a direct request based on need. Johnson looked at Grace carefully. Johnson observed that Grace's clothing was clean, but worn and mended in several places. Johnson observed that Grace appeared thin, and that her expression showed hunger, rather than the opportunistic cunning that might characterize a child attempting to manipulate adults for money. Johnson asked Grace where she lived. Grace explained that she lived at Harlem Mission Home for Children on West 133rd Street. Johnson asked whether the mission did not provide meals. Grace explained that the mission did provide meals, but that she had been sent on an errand and had not eaten since morning, and was very hungry. Johnson reached into his coat pocket and removed his wallet. Johnson took out $2 bills and handed them to Grace. Johnson stated that Grace should buy herself something to eat and that she should return to the mission before the staff became concerned about her absence. Grace thanked Johnson, took the money, and walked quickly to a nearby restaurant where she purchased a sandwich and a glass of milk. The interaction lasted perhaps 3 minutes. For Grace, it meant the difference between continuing to be hungry and having a proper meal. For Johnson, the interaction might have ended there as one of many small charitable acts he performed regularly throughout Harlem. However, what happened next was different. Johnson did not simply return to his conversation with Reynolds and forget about Grace. Instead, Johnson stood on the sidewalk for several moments, thinking about what he had just witnessed. Johnson turned to Reynolds and asked what Reynolds knew about Harlem Mission Home for Children. Reynolds explained that the mission was a small operation that housed orphaned and abandoned children, that it operated with very limited funding, and that the facility was known to be overcrowded and poorly resourced. Reynolds mentioned that several children from the mission attended the same school as Reynolds's nephew, and that these children often appeared hungry and wore inadequate clothing during cold weather. Johnson walked away from the barber shop and headed toward his office, located above a nightclub on Lenox Avenue. As Johnson walked, he thought about Grace and about what her situation represented. Johnson understood that Grace was not unique. Johnson knew that Harlem was home to hundreds of children who had lost parents to disease, violence, or abandonment, and who had nowhere to go. Johnson knew that the existing charitable institutions that served these children were chronically underfunded, overcrowded, and unable to provide adequate care. Johnson knew that many orphaned children ended up living on the streets, sleeping in abandoned buildings, surviving through petty theft and begging, and frequently being drawn into criminal activities or becoming victims of exploitation. Johnson reached his office and sat at his desk. Johnson spent the next hour thinking about the problem of orphaned children in Harlem and about what might be done to address it. Johnson realized that giving money to individual children like Grace was helpful in the moment, but did nothing to solve the underlying systemic problem. Johnson realized that the existing charitable institutions were doing the best they could with limited resources, but that their best was inadequate. Johnson realized that what was needed was a new institution, properly funded and properly staffed, that could provide genuine care and support for orphaned children rather than merely warehousing them in overcrowded facilities. Johnson understood that creating such an institution would require significant resources, substantial planning, coalition building with various community figures and organizations, navigating legal and regulatory requirements for operating a children's home, securing appropriate property, hiring qualified staff, and developing sustainable funding mechanisms to ensure the institution could operate over the long term. Johnson also understood that he had access to resources and influence that could make such a project possible if he chose to commit to it. Over the following week, Johnson made inquiries about the state of orphan care in Harlem and about what would be required to establish a new children's home. Johnson spoke with the Reverend Thompson from Mount Olive Baptist Church and with several other ministers who were involved in charitable work in the community. These conversations confirmed what Johnson had suspected. The existing institutions were overwhelmed. Harlem Mission Home housed 23 children in a facility designed for 12. St. James Children's Home on West 142nd Street housed 31 children with a staff of 4. Bethel House for Children on West 138th Street housed 18 children and was operating at a deficit that threatened its continued existence. Johnson spoke with Dr. Robert Harrison, a physician who provided medical care to children at several Harlem institutions and who had extensive knowledge of child welfare issues. Harrison explained that proper care for orphaned children required not just food and shelter, but also medical care, education, emotional support, and preparation for eventual independence. Harrison explained that most existing institutions could barely provide basic food and shelter and had no resources for the comprehensive care that children actually needed. Johnson spoke with Margaret Anderson, a social worker who had been placing orphaned children in various institutions for 12 years and who understood both the regulatory requirements for operating children's homes and the practical challenges involved. Anderson explained that establishing a new children's home would require obtaining a license from the New York State Department of Social Welfare, meeting specific standards for physical facilities, hiring staff with appropriate qualifications, developing policies and procedures that complied with state regulations, and demonstrating financial sustainability. By late November 1954, Johnson had developed a clear understanding of what would be required and had made a decision to proceed. Johnson decided to establish a new orphanage in Harlem. that would be named Grace House, in honor of the girl whose request for food had triggered his recognition of the broader problem. The orphanage would house 30 children initially, with potential for expansion if resources allowed. The orphanage would provide not just food and shelter, but comprehensive care, including medical services, educational support, recreational activities, and preparation for eventual transition to independent living or adoption. Johnson began assembling the coalition of people who would be necessary to make the project succeed. Johnson recruited Reverend Thompson to serve as chairman of a board of directors that would oversee the orphanage's operations and ensure community accountability. Johnson recruited Dr. Harrison to serve as medical director and to provide regular health care for children in the home. Johnson recruited Margaret Anderson to serve as director of the facility and to handle licensing requirements and daily operations. Johnson recruited James Wilson, a businessman who owned several properties in Harlem, to assist with identifying and securing appropriate real estate for the orphanage. Johnson recruited Helen Carter, who wrote for the Amsterdam News, to help publicize the project and generate community support and donations. Johnson recruited Thomas Williams, who operated a successful grocery business, to coordinate food supplies for the orphanage. Johnson recruited Sarah Mitchell, a retired teacher, to develop educational programming that would supplement what children received in public schools. Each of these individuals brought specific expertise and connections that would be essential to creating and sustaining the institution. The coalition held its first formal meeting on December 3, 1954, at Mount Olive Baptist Church. Johnson explained his vision for Grace House and the role he wanted each person to play. Johnson stated that he would provide the initial funding necessary to acquire property and begin construction or renovation, but that the orphanage would need to develop sustainable funding through donations, fundraising events, and possibly contracts with the city or state for providing child welfare services. Johnson stated that the project would take months to complete, but that he was committed to seeing it through to successful operation. The coalition agreed on a strategic plan that included 5 major components. First, identify and secure appropriate property for the orphanage. Second, complete necessary construction or renovation to meet state licensing requirements. Third, hire qualified staff including house parents, teachers, cooks, and maintenance workers. Fourth, obtain licensing from the New York State Department of Social Welfare. Fifth, develop sustainable funding mechanisms, including a donor network, fundraising events, and potential government contracts. James Wilson identified a property on West 136th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenues that appeared suitable for conversion to a children's home. The property was a 5-story brownstone building that had previously been used as a boarding house, but had been vacant for approximately 18 months after the previous owner had died, and the estate had been slow to sell the property. The building had 22 rooms across 5 floors, a large basement that could be converted to recreation space, and a small yard behind the building that could be used for outdoor activities. The property was being offered for sale at $18,000. Johnson inspected the property on December 10th and determined that it would be suitable if significant renovation work was completed. The building needed new plumbing, electrical system upgrades, repair of the roof, replacement of several windows, installation of fire safety equipment to meet current codes, painting throughout, and conversion of some larger rooms into dormitory-style sleeping areas for children. Wilson estimated that renovation costs would total approximately $12,000 if the work could be completed by contractors who would provide favorable pricing. Johnson purchased the property on December 17, 1954, paying the full $18,000 in cash. Johnson then contracted with Harold Peterson Construction Company to complete the necessary renovation work. Peterson was a black-owned construction firm that had been operating in Harlem for 15 years, and that maintained good relationships with Johnson through various business dealings. Peterson agreed to complete the renovation work for $11,500, slightly below Wilson's estimate, and to prioritize the project to ensure completion by April 1955. While construction was underway, Margaret Anderson worked on preparing the application for state licensing. Anderson compiled detailed information about the facility's physical specifications, staffing plans, policies and procedures, educational programming, medical care arrangements, food service plans, safety protocols, and financial projections. The application required extensive documentation and needed to demonstrate that Grace House would meet or exceed all state standards for children's residential facilities. Anderson submitted the preliminary application to the Department of Social Welfare on January 15, 1955, and beginning a review process that typically took 3 to 4 months. Helen Carter published the first article about Grace House in the Amsterdam News on January 19, 1955. The article explained the project's origins, described the facility that was being created, and called for community support through donations and volunteer assistance. The article included specific information about the kinds of donations that would be most useful, including furniture for children's rooms, kitchen equipment, bedding, clothing in various sizes, books and educational materials, and toys and recreational equipment. The article also included information about how readers could make financial contributions to support the orphanage's operations. The response to the article exceeded the coalition's expectations. Within 1 week, more than 40 people had contacted Mount Olive Baptist Church offering donations or volunteer assistance. Several businesses offered to provide goods at reduced cost or to make financial contributions. Several churches organized collection drives to gather clothing, bedding, and other needed items. By the end of January, Grace House had received donations totaling approximately $3,000 in cash and goods worth an additional $2,000. Margaret Anderson began hiring staff in February 1955. Anderson hired Joseph and Martha Henderson, a married couple in their 40s who had extensive experience working with children, to serve as head house parents and to live in the facility full-time. Anderson hired 2 additional house parents who would work in shifts to provide 24-hour supervision of children. Anderson hired a cook who would prepare 3 meals daily for residents and staff. Anderson hired a maintenance worker who would handle repairs and general upkeep of the building and grounds. Sarah Mitchell developed an educational support program that would include after-school tutoring, homework assistance, a library of books for different age levels, and enrichment activities including music, art, and field trips to museums and cultural institutions. Mitchell recruited 3 volunteer tutors who would work with children several evenings per week. Mitchell also established relationships with several Harlem schools to ensure coordination between Grace House and the public education system. Dr. Harrison arranged for regular medical care, including monthly health screenings for all children, immediate care for any illnesses or injuries, a dental care through a partnership with a Harlem dental clinic, and vision care, including eye exams and glasses for children who needed them. Harrison also arranged for mental health support through a social worker who would meet with children experiencing emotional difficulties and would provide counseling as needed. Construction work progressed steadily through the winter months. By mid-March 1955, Peterson's crew had completed the plumbing and electrical upgrades, repaired the roof, replaced windows, installed fire safety equipment including extinguishers and emergency lighting, and painted the interior. Workers were completing final tasks, including installation of new kitchen equipment, repair of the basement floor, and landscaping work in the small yard. Peterson confirmed that all work would be completed by March 28th, a meeting the April 1st target that had been established. On March 15th, state inspectors from the Department of Social Welfare conducted their first site visit to evaluate whether the facility met licensing requirements. The inspectors examined the physical facility, reviewed documentation about staffing and policies, interviewed Margaret Anderson about operational plans, and identified several minor deficiencies that needed to be corrected. These deficiencies included the need for additional fire extinguishers on the upper floors, installation of locks on medication storage cabinets, and revision of some policy language to match state standards more precisely. Anderson addressed all identified deficiencies within 2 weeks. On April 5th, as state inspectors conducted a second site visit and confirmed that all deficiencies had been corrected and that Grace House met all requirements for licensing as a children's residential facility. On April 12, 1955, the Department of Social Welfare issued a provisional license that would allow Grace House to begin operations while final paperwork was being processed. The license authorized the facility to house up to 30 children, ages 4 through 16. Grace House officially opened on April 18, 1955, 5 months after Johnson's initial decision to proceed with the project. The opening was marked by a dedication ceremony attended by approximately 150 people, including community leaders, donors, volunteers, and representatives from other charitable organizations. Reverend Thompson led a prayer blessing the facility and its mission. Johnson spoke briefly, explaining that the orphanage had been created to provide proper care for Harlem's orphaned children, and that it was named after a 9-year-old girl whose simple request for food had made him recognize the urgent need for better child welfare services in the community. The first children were admitted to Grace House during the week following the opening ceremony. Margaret Anderson worked with the New York City Department of Welfare to identify children who needed placement and who would benefit from Grace House's services. The first residents included 8 children transferred from overcrowded facilities elsewhere in Harlem, 3 children who had been living in temporary foster care, and 2 children who had been living on the streets. By the end of May 1955, Grace House was housing 22 children. Grace Williams, whose encounter with Johnson had inspired the project, was among the children transferred to Grace House. Grace moved from Harlem Mission Home to Grace House on May 3, 1955. When Anderson explained to Grace that the orphanage had been named after her, Grace appeared confused and asked why Johnson would do such a thing in response to her asking for $2. Anderson explained that Johnson had seen Grace's hunger as evidence of a larger problem and had decided to create an institution that would ensure no child in Harlem had to go hungry or live in inadequate conditions. The difference between Grace House and Harlem Mission Home was immediately apparent to the children who transferred. Grace House provided 3 substantial meals daily plus snacks. Children slept 2 to a room rather than 6 to a room. Each child had their own bed, dresser, and storage space for personal belongings. The building was warm in winter and had adequate ventilation in summer. Children received regular medical and dental care. Children had access to books, educational support, and recreational activities. The staff ratio was much better, with 1 adult for every 5 children compared to 1 adult for every 8 children at the mission. Operating Grace House required substantial ongoing funding. Johnson had provided approximately $40,000 to purchase and renovate the property and to cover initial operating costs. However, the orphanage's annual operating budget was projected at approximately $18,000 for staffing, food, utilities, medical care, educational materials, and other expenses. The coalition developed multiple funding streams to ensure sustainability. First, Grace House established a donor network of individuals and businesses who made regular monthly or annual contributions. By September 1955, approximately 60 donors were providing consistent financial support totaling about $4,000 annually. Second, the orphanage organized fundraising events, including an annual benefit dinner that raised approximately $3,000. Third, Grace House contracted with New York City to provide residential care for children referred by the Department of Welfare, receiving payment of approximately $40 per child per month. With 20 to 25 children placed through city referrals, this contract provided approximately $10,000 annually. Fourth, and several Harlem churches made Grace House a designated recipient of special collections, contributing approximately $1,000 annually. Fifth, Johnson himself continued to provide supplemental funding when needed to cover budget shortfalls or unexpected expenses. The combination of these funding sources allowed Grace House to operate successfully while maintaining higher standards of care than many existing institutions. The impact of Grace House extended beyond the children who lived there. The facility's existence demonstrated that well-funded, well-managed institutions could provide genuinely good care for orphaned children rather than merely warehousing them. Other charitable organizations in Harlem began studying Grace House's model and attempting to improve their own operations. Some organizations requested technical assistance from Grace House staff about how to implement similar programs and standards. The City Department of Welfare took notice of Grace House's success and began referring more children to the facility because officials recognized that placement there led to better outcomes than placement in overcrowded or poorly managed institutions. By 1957, Grace House was consistently operating at or near its licensed capacity of 30 children, and there was a waiting list of children who needed placement. Grace Williams lived at Grace House for 6 years. During that time, Grace completed elementary school and began attending junior high school. Grace received consistent medical care that addressed health problems that had gone untreated during her time at Harlem Mission Home. Grace participated in tutoring and enrichment programs that helped her academic performance improve significantly. Grace developed friendships with other children at the facility and received emotional support from staff who had time to attend to individual children's needs. In June 1961, when Grace was 16 years old, a distant cousin named Dorothy Williams was located through social services. Dorothy was Grace's mother's cousin and lived in Brooklyn. Dorothy had not known about Grace's mother's death or about Grace being in an orphanage, but when contacted by social workers, Dorothy stated that she would be willing to take custody of Grace. After a trial period and appropriate legal procedures, Grace moved to Brooklyn to live with Dorothy in September 1961. Grace finished high school while living with Dorothy and later attended secretarial school before finding employment with an insurance company. Grace House continued operating after Grace Williams departed. The facility maintained its standards of care and continued serving children through the 1960s. After Johnson's death in July 1968, the Board of Directors established an endowment in his memory to help ensure the orphanage's long-term financial stability. Additional community leaders stepped forward to continue Johnson's role as principal benefactor and to ensure that funding remained adequate. The orphanage operated continuously until 1973, when changes in child welfare policy led to an emphasis on foster care placement rather than institutional care for orphaned children. As the number of children needing institutional placement declined, Grace House transitioned its mission to providing group home services for older teenagers who were preparing for independent living. This transition allowed the facility to continue serving vulnerable children while adapting to changing social service paradigms. The story of Grace House and its origins became one of many narratives about Bumpy Johnson's role in Harlem that illustrated both his criminal power and his commitment to addressing community needs. The story was discussed in churches, barbershops, and social gatherings. The story reinforced understanding that Johnson, despite his criminal activities, maintained genuine concern for vulnerable community members and was willing to commit substantial resources to addressing problems that formal institutions had failed to solve. For the broader community, Grace House represented what was possible when resources, organization, and commitment came together to address social problems. The orphanage demonstrated that inadequate child welfare services were not inevitable, that high-quality care was achievable if proper funding and management were provided, and that community mobilization could create institutions that served needs the government either could not or would not address adequately. For the children who lived at Grace House during its years of operation, the facility provided stability, care, and opportunities that significantly affected their life trajectories. Studies of children who aged out of Grace House showed that they had higher rates of high school completion, lower rates of criminal involvement, and better employment outcomes compared to children who had been placed in lower-quality institutions during the same period. The comprehensive care model that Grace House implemented proved effective at preparing children for successful adulthood. For Johnson himself, the creation of Grace House represented one of his most significant charitable accomplishments. Johnson had given money to individuals and families throughout his time in Harlem, but Grace House was different in scale and ambition. The orphanage required Johnson to think systematically about social problems rather than responding to individual cases. And the orphanage required Johnson to build coalitions and coordinate multiple people with different expertise. The orphanage required Johnson to commit resources over years rather than making one-time gifts. The orphanage created a lasting institution that continued serving children long after the initial encounter with Grace Williams that had inspired it. The case illustrated broader themes about how informal power structures in Harlem during the 1950s and 1960s sometimes provided services and addressed needs that formal government and charitable systems failed to meet adequately. Grace House existed because Johnson had access to capital, influence, and organizational capacity that allowed him to create an institution when he decided it was needed. And the orphanage's funding model relied partly on government contracts, but also significantly on private donations and Johnson's own continued financial support, demonstrating the hybrid nature of many social services in communities like Harlem. These informal systems had significant limitations. They depended on the decisions and priorities of powerful individuals who had no democratic accountability and who might change their focus or withdraw support at any time. They existed alongside rather than replacing inadequate formal systems. They sometimes involved resources derived from illegal activities being redirected toward legitimate charitable purposes, creating moral complexity about whether the good accomplished justified or offset the harm caused by the criminal activities that generated the resources. However, these informal systems also demonstrated that communities could develop mechanisms to address urgent needs even when formal systems failed them. Grace House provided real benefit to real children regardless of the complexity of its origins. The orphanage showed that systematic thinking about social problems could produce institutional solutions rather than just individual charity. The orphanage proved that high-quality child welfare services were achievable when proper resources and management were committed to creating them. The story of how a 9-year-old girl asking for $2 led to the creation of an orphanage that served hundreds of children over nearly 2 decades became emblematic of Johnson's dual nature as both criminal and community benefactor. The story raised questions that remained debated. Whether Johnson's charitable works redeemed his criminal activities or simply represented public relations efforts designed to maintain community support for his illegal operations. Whether the resources Johnson committed to Grace House would have been better directed elsewhere if they had been earned through legitimate means and donated through formal charitable channels. Whether informal charitable systems led by powerful individuals were preferable to inadequate formal systems, or whether they simply represented another form of paternalism that allowed communities to avoid demanding better government services. What remained beyond debate was that Grace Williams and hundreds of other children received care at Grace House that was substantially better than what they would have received in the overcrowded, underfunded institutions where they otherwise would have been placed. Whether this outcome justified the means used to achieve it, whether Johnson deserved credit for creating the orphanage or criticism for deriving his resources from crime, whether Grace House represented genuine community service or sophisticated self-interest, these questions continued to generate discussion and disagreement decades after the events occurred. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by someone who understood that individual charity could be scaled to institutional impact, that addressing social problems required systematic planning and coalition building rather than just good intentions, that creating sustainable institutions required developing multiple funding streams and professional management rather than relying on charismatic leadership alone, and that real change came from transforming systems rather than just helping individuals navigate inadequate systems that remained fundamentally unchanged.